In 1973, sociologist Mark Granovetter demonstrated that job seekers benefited more from their weak ties, acquaintances and familiar strangers than from their strong ties with close friends and colleagues. Now, 50 years later, a new research project on weak ties and job seekers has been completed, involving 20 million people worldwide, 2 billion ties and 600,000 job changes. To explain what this new research means, please welcome Sinan Aral. Sinan is the best-selling author of The Hype Machine. He's the David Austin Professor of Management, Marketing, IT and Data Science at MIT, Director of the MIT Initiative on the Digital Economy. Sinan.
Well, this has been such a fantastic event, and we've heard so many great ideas about so many important topics, from polarization to fake news, splinternet, workforce, hybrid work, remote work. Today I want to talk a little bit about a particular aspect of digital society that is supremely important, which is the notion of how digital and algorithms affect employment. And this is critical because we're at a moment where the world has seen one of the greatest transitions because of COVID through a series of shocks to employment where lots of people lost their jobs, difficulties finding income, huge economic upheaval, followed by a roaring comeback after the pandemic of employment as it surged back from 2021 and beyond around the world. And what we've noticed in recent times is that while in the past employment has been very industrial in terms of recruiting being traditional or done face-to-face or applications sent in on paper or over email, a lot of the job matching that happens today is algorithmic. So the economy in terms of employment and unemployment is more and more mediated by digital algorithms than we've ever seen before in human history. And this gives us an opportunity to sort of juxtapose management theory that is now 50 years old with the modern day, to understand how employment and unemployment changes as a result of digital innovation. And so what I want to do today is talk for a little bit of time about a study that does intro just a second ago that involved 20 million people from around the world and is really an opportunity to examine fundamentally a historic management theory, a theory that has been very long-lived, one that is extremely popular, has some of the most citations in the academic literature of any social science paper that we've ever seen, and one that has really stood the test of time in terms of some of the conversation that we've seen about how people get information, about how people contribute to innovation, about how people find jobs. And juxtapose that with the modern day, how algorithms and modern digital technologies are changing the way our social networks help us identify opportunities, innovation, and help us find jobs. And this really has to do with a topic that is front and center and really important for policymakers, for firms, and for individual workers today, and that is unemployment. When COVID hit, we saw the biggest spike in unemployment in nearly 100 years. And this was a shock that was felt around the world. It wasn't localized to any given country because the pandemic shut us all in. It destroyed in-person business in a way that we haven't seen in a long, long time. And then after the pandemic began to be ameliorated, as vaccines were taken up, as COVID became less and less important to our public health over time, we saw changes in that employment history. This, for example, shows you how severe the shock was just in New York City. On the left-hand side, you see employment, or I should say unemployment in February 2020 in New York City, in Brooklyn, and the Bronx, and you see very little unemployment throughout the city. And then just a few months later in June, you see essentially the entire city almost experiencing dramatic increases in unemployment. Obviously, if you see Manhattan there in the middle, which seems to be correlated with income and or socioeconomic status, high income, finance jobs, things that can be teleworked or hybrid worked, less likely to experience unemployment than other parts of the city. But you just see how dramatic this shift was. And this was something that really did affix the world's attention from a policymaker perspective and also from an individual perspective. It's extremely difficult to take a shock like this across the world with so much unemployment happening to so many people all at once. But afterwards, we saw historic employment numbers as the monthly changes in jobs. This is just for the most recent amount of time in the United States, reaching hundreds of thousands, close to millions of jobs being created month on month, just nearly 500,000 in January 2023 in the United States. And what we've seen after the pandemic is near historic 53-year lows in unemployment as the economy came roaring back. And I think the thing to think about here is how different the process of employment, job seeking, job finding, talent search and fulfillment, if you're looking at the perspective of the firm, is today compared to just 20 years ago or 30 years ago. And if you look back 40 plus years ago, it's a completely different process. And what I mean by that is that this process is now extremely digitally mediated. That on one side you have labor demand, firms that want to hire. On the other side you have labor supply, you have workers seeking jobs. You have traditional third parties like recruitment agencies that are participating in the process, trying to help match job seekers with open jobs and enterprises trying to hire. But all of this is mediated by new technologies like the platforms that are employing people and social media that are using application programming interfaces to attach to those platforms in order to participate in the recruitment process and in the employment process. And more, nearly ubiquitously on these platforms now, these processes are run by algorithms that are designed not only to match individuals to jobs, but also to essentially direct or guide the social network that connects professionals, whether it's job seekers and employers or just colleagues and people in the same industry. And a great example of that is LinkedIn. So LinkedIn is the world's largest professional social network, and this platform is used for a number of things, including finding jobs, seeking jobs. That's certainly one of the main activities that we engage in on a platform like LinkedIn. But we also share professional content. We network, we exchange ideas, and a lot of that activity is guided by, shaped by, in large part determined by algorithms. For example, the feed algorithms that determine which content you see on LinkedIn, whether it's a job post or an idea from a colleague or an article about a new technology that's relevant to your industry, or whether it's what we call the friend suggestion algorithms, or in LinkedIn's case, the people you may know algorithms, which suggest to you new people that you might want to connect with professionally. Those algorithms are not random. They are choosing based on the optimization of some objective function who you should get in touch with next. And as those algorithms unfold and in a cyclical pattern interact with the choices that human beings make about which of those suggestions to take and which of them to ignore, they shape the structure of the social network that connects us all professionally and determines what new ideas we see, what new jobs we have access to, what new professional activities we may or may not want to engage in. So this new algorithmic reality of employment and unemployment is not only critical to understanding how jobs are provided and taken in the economy today, but is also a sort of stage on which we can examine some of the most fundamental management theories regarding how people get jobs, how ideas are transmitted, and how the economy evolves as a function of this social process. And what I'm talking about here is a famous study by Mark Granovetter that Des alluded to called The Strength of Weak Ties. This is such a famous study now that the phrase, the strength of weak ties, is part of the popular nomenclature that people who are unrelated to academia have heard of and know about. And it turns out that this study is published nearly to the day 50 years after the original Strength of Weak Ties study. So the study that I'm going to talk about that we conducted happened almost exactly 50 years after the original publication of Mark Granovetter's famous paper in 1973. And this really is a fundamental management theory. If you look at Mark Granovetter's historical citations over time, what you notice is that this is one of the most widely cited social science theories in the last 100 years. Certainly, as it relates to this topic area of employment and economics, it's probably the #1 cited paper in all of the literature. So as of just a few days ago, this paper has nearly 70,000 citations, which by itself would constitute a superstar career for an individual over their entire lifetime, let alone the citation rate of a single paper. And if you look at Mark Granovetter's several other related works that are about the same topic, such as his famous paper on economic action and social structure, or a paper he wrote that revisited the theory, or his famous book about getting a job, when you put all these things together, you realize, wow, this idea, this single idea, is one of the most influential management ideas in the history of management ideas. And that's not an understatement, I don't think. What does this theory say? So essentially what this theory says is that there are social networks that connect us all in various ways, and that these social networks have a certain pattern or a structure to them, where individuals are connected within groups or clusters or cliques with each other, and that every once in a while there will be a bridging tie that connects disparate groups to one another. And these bridging ties are what are known as weak ties. So these are ties that are relationships between members of different groups. They're utilized infrequently and therefore don't need a lot of management to stay healthy. And they lead to a diversity of ideas, so the theory goes, and they provide people with novel information that they wouldn't get from their own tight-knit social circle that they typically are communicating with. And on the other hand, there are strong ties, which are relationships between people who work, live, or play together frequently, people who are always talking, people who are in the same social circle. And these types of ties are amongst people that tend to think alike, that tend to share their ideas all the time, and so are swimming in, quote unquote, the same pools of information. So why is it that we have these kinds of ties, and how is it that human social networks evolve in this way? It's worth going through a very brief whirlwind tour of sort of a series of discoveries that we've made about human social networks that really put all of this in perspective. And it all starts with this conjecture by Mark Granovetter in 1973 called the forbidden triad. And what this forbidden triad argument says in Granovetter's terms is that, let's say you have connections between three people, Alice, Bob, and Clara here, A, B, and C. Granovetter's argument in the forbidden triad is that if Alice has a strong tie to Bob, and if Alice has a strong tie to Clara, then it's very highly likely that Bob and Clara are going to have at least a weak tie, if not a strong tie. And why is that? There's a lot of reasons for this. So, for example, if Alice and Bob, A and B, have a strong tie, and Alice and Clara, A and C, have a strong tie, then it's likely they have very similar interests, that they have similar opinions, that they like the same things, that they are interested in the same things. And if Bob and Clara, B and C, were ever to meet, they would discover by the transitive property of human relationships that, oh wow, they also have a lot of things in common. They also like the same things. They're also interested in the same things. So they would have an affinity to one another by the nature of Alice and Bob and Alice and Clara having strong ties. Another reason is that if Alice and Bob spend a lot of time together, and if Alice and Clara spend a lot of time together, then it's highly likely that Bob and Clara are going to eventually run into each other because they're going to be in the same social circle. They're going to be together with Alice a lot, so they're going to find a chance to run into each other. And a third reason why you would imagine that Bob and Clara would have strong relationships with each other is that if Bob and Clara had tension, if eventually their relationship dissolved, it would put so much pressure on Alice to have to sort of choose between them. Who are you going to be friends with? That it would strain relationships between Alice and Bob and between Alice and Clara such that it would dissolve unless this triangle were to stick together. Because of all of these, aspects of human relationships, what we see is a persistent pattern in the way human beings make relationships with each other, which is called triadic closure, which means that if you have two ends of a triangle of relationships, it's very likely that that third leg of the triangle is going to close, meaning that that relationship is going to be formed and is going to be a strong relationship. And this triadic closure in human relationships create what's in networks called network clustering. As triads close, it creates bunches and bunches of clusters of human beings closely tied together. And this triadic closure and this network clustering is seen throughout any kind of data set that you might examine on human social relationships. So I personally and many of our colleagues here at MIT and elsewhere have studied social networks, small social networks, large social networks, big data sets from Facebook and small survey data sets and lots of other types of data about social networks. And what we find is that this clustering, these cliques, are abundant. They're ubiquitous. They're always found in networks of humans relating to one another. So this is a co-authorship graph of people who might work together in academia. And this is biotech collaborations demonstrating lots of clustering amongst the collaborators. This is a famous paper by Owen Mooney, and this is his own personal social network graph. And what you see is clusters that are directly related to, on one side, his family, and then on one side, Florida State University, where he teaches, and on another side, the University of California at San Diego, where he went to graduate school, and on another side, Indiana University, where he went to undergrad, and on another side, high school, which is located near Indiana University. And you see these very clear clusters of individuals that are, related to Owen Mooney in their friendships with him, but also clustered together based on how they know each other. And the thing about this clustering is that it enables what's known as brokerage, which means that if an individual happens to be the tie that binds some of these clusters together, they act as a broker of information, of resources, of ideas, of support between these clusters. And those brokers are essentially the ones that are maintaining weak ties that connect these clusters together. So here is an example of a broker that might connect these clusters together and be the gatekeeper or the conduit of novel information, of interesting things that are known to outside clusters but may not be known to the cluster that they sit in. And these bridges that connect these clusters are typically going to be weak ties. Because if you think about triadic closure, you know that if I'm connected to A and B, if I'm connected to A with a strong tie, and if I'm connected to B with a strong tie, then it's likely A and B are going to connect and create a closing of a triangle like we talked about before. So the only way that triangle maintains itself not being closed is if I have an arm's length relationship with that other person, if I'm infrequently talking to them, if it's once in a while, etc. So these bridges that connect the clusters, more often than not, tend to be weak ties rather than strong ties. And that's essentially where Granovetter gets his proposal for the strength of weak ties. That yes, these weak ties are infrequent. They may have less emotional intensity. They may have less communication frequency. They may have less reason to be socially supportive of one another, but it's their weakness that allows them to be the connections between clusters without collapsing the clusters onto each other. And what that allows for is the transmission of novel information, which I'll get to in a minute. But the basic idea is, you may have heard the phrase, it's important to think out of the box. Well, network theorists like to say it's important to think out of your network, because imagine I'm a physicist thinking about a cutting-edge physics problem, and I only talk to people in my department about that problem. We're all going to think about the problem in the same way. We're all going to approach it the same. The way that my colleague thinks about it is going to influence me. The way that I think about it is going to influence my colleague. And suddenly we're going to sort of have a very homogeneous approach to the problem. But if we invite somebody from a completely different university who is in a different department, say they're in mechanical engineering, and we say, okay, what do you think about this problem? They may come at it from a completely different perspective and provide that innovative spark that we need to sort of solve that problem that is intractable given our local knowledge. And the only way that that is maintained is if their cluster of information remains separate from ours, so that the thinking in that cluster is different from the thinking in our cluster, and it maintains a diversity of thought across those two clusters. Now, the final piece of the puzzle is, well, how is that novel thinking transmitted into my cluster? It's through the weak tie. And the reason it's through the weak tie is because that tie bridges the clusters, and it's important that it's weak, because if it was strong, those clusters would collapse in on each other because of triadic closure. So that sort of gives you a summary of Granovetter's argument. And typically, another way of looking at this is that these bridges across the clusters are spanning what are known in the literature as structural holes in the human social network. So if I can be a bridge over one of these holes, then I am privileged to have access to novel information, and then I'm the conduit for these novel opportunities, this novel information, and these novel ideas. Now, this is also particularly related to another very common idea in the nomenclature of human social networks, which is this notion of small worlds. You may have heard of the Kevin Bacon game, 6 degrees of separation. Everybody's connected to Kevin Bacon in just a few steps. And that's true across all of humanity. So it's been shown in very large-scale studies, survey studies offline, as well as studies of Facebook, that basically, on average, every human on Earth is connected to every other human on Earth within 6 degrees, 6 hops from person to person to person. Well, how is that possible with so many people on Earth and people living halfway around the world? Well, it's possible because of these bridges, because these bridges are connecting the clusters that if we traverse those bridges, it only takes a few, up to 6, to get from any person on Earth to any other person on Earth. Well, how does that happen? Well, it happens because these bridges are what create small worlds. When you have a social structure that is cluster and cluster and cluster and cluster connected by these bridges, it creates a scenario that Duncan Watts and Steve Strogatz described as being a small world, which is characterized by high clustering and very low path lengths between any individuals on Earth across a vast space of possible network configurations in the human social network. And this graph to scientists is at once very improbable and very famous because it shows that the theory predicts, and what the empirical evidence shows, is that that's exactly what human social networks look like. Lots of clustering and very low path length between any two individuals. The weird thing about this, and the reason it's so surprising, is that when you have a lot of clustering, you don't expect to have these short path lengths. And the only reason we can have a lot of clustering and have these short path lengths is because of weak bridging ties. So that's sort of a whirlwind summary of the social structure of human social networks that enables the strength of weak ties. And the strength of weak ties really comes from what Granovetter describes as this information advantage for these types of ties. And what does that mean? Well, imagine you have a social network of several different types of people, here just represented by colors. You have people who know blue stuff and people who know yellow stuff and red stuff and orange stuff. And imagine that they're sort of separated into these clusters. Well, the value of information comes from its uneven distribution across these network clusters or these network neighborhoods. And the connection to diverse neighborhoods is what gives access to these novel pools of information. Any one of these clusters is swimming in the same information or ways of thinking, and outside the clusters, they're swimming in different ways of thinking. So the novel information is valuable because it's scarce locally. So actors that have access to this scarce novel information, they can broker opportunities, engage in information arbitrage, or use information as a commodity. They can apply information to problems that are intractable given the local knowledge, and that's where you get the innovation benefits of weak ties, and that's where you get the novel ideas benefits of weak ties, and that's where brokers have access to these opportunities before anyone else because they see them first in the social network. So this person in the middle here, the red node, has access to the green ideas and the blue ideas and the purple ideas and the yellow ideas, so they have privileged information competitive advantage over everyone else in this network. And empirically, among these 70,000 citations is paper after paper after paper showing that networks that are diverse, networks that have weak ties, tend to be associated with early promotion or higher profit margins or innovation, creativity, and good ideas. On the left-hand side here, you see on the y-axis the managerial evaluation of one's ideas dropping precipitously as you have fewer bridges and fewer weak ties in your network. On the right-hand side, as you have fewer bridges and fewer weak ties in your network, as you go left to right, you have a higher probability of having ideas that are going to be dismissed by others and a higher probability of having no idea at all that would be interesting to someone else. It's also critical for employment, as Granovetter postulated in his famous study of contacts and careers in his book, Getting a Job. And the description here is that in this classic study not only proves, quote, that it's not what you know, but who you know, but also demonstrates how social activity influences labor markets. So Granovetter recognizes networking as the crucial link between economic studies of labor mobility and more focused studies of an individual's motivation to find work. This is also very critical for firms because, as we know, hiring and talent and recruitment is essential to building high-quality human resources inside an organization, which is then going to differentiate winners from losers in the competitive landscape among firms out there in the marketplace. And one final bit of empirical evidence as to how important this is, it's not just about profit, early promotion, finding a job, competitive advantage amongst organizations, but it's also critical to individual social mobility and thus inequality and an equitable society. So there was a really big study, famous now, very recent study, published by my friends and colleagues, Raj Chetty, Matt Jackson, and their colleagues in Nature in 2022. They used data on 21 billion friendships from Facebook, and they found that the share of high socioeconomic status friends amongst individuals with low socioeconomic status, which they termed economic connectedness, is among the strongest predictors of upward income mobility identified to date. And in fact, if children with low SES parents were to have grown up in counties with economic connectedness comparable to that of the average child in a high SES, with high SES parents, their incomes in adulthood would increase by 20% on average, which means bridging economic status clusters is one of the single most important indicators of social mobility and thus social solutions to income inequality and the creation of an equitable economic society. So the importance of this theory is really hard to overstate. Now, recently, we've seen some empirical evidence that seems to suggest that there's a paradox of weak ties. This study by Laura G. and colleagues, which was one of the biggest non-experimental studies of this theory, used data from 17 million social ties in 55 countries from Facebook, and they found that in every country the likelihood of going to work where an individual friend works is increasing, not decreasing with tie strength. So they basically found that strong ties were more important than weak ties. This was a really important sort of moment in the empirical literature about weak ties because it essentially said, wait a minute, in the largest study to date, it's not weak ties, it's strong ties that matter for getting a job. But these authors rightfully acknowledge that their results, quote, may not be the true causal effect of tie strength on the probability of a sequential job because this was not experimental. They were looking at observational data and there might have been other selection biases in what they were witnessing in their data. At the end of the day, though, these causal effects are essential to understanding this theory for two reasons. One, to know whether weak ties really benefit people in finding jobs because of the information advantage, you have to have causal evidence. Otherwise, it could just be some third factor that's correlated with getting a job and having weak ties that's actually the driver of getting the job. And so the theory depends on the causal evidence. But practically, it's also relevant to have causal evidence because knowing the cause and effect of how people get jobs is going to be the key to designing algorithms that help employment, that help ameliorate inequality, that actually solve the problems that the theory purports to be able to address. And that's where our study comes in. So we published this study called A Causal Test of the Strength of Weak Ties in Science just a few months ago. And this is joint work with Kartik Rajkumar, Guillaume Saint-Jacques, Yav Bojanov, and Eric Brynjolfsson. And what we did in this study is we worked with LinkedIn to randomly vary the prevalence of weak ties in people's LinkedIn networks. And I'll tell you how we did that in just a second. And we did this in the social networks of 20 million people across many different countries, 5 continents. We conducted this study over a 5-year span. 2 billion new ties were created during this experiment, and 600,000 new job transfers were created during this experiment. So a very large study testing this age-old management theory that has had so much influence both in practice and in the academic literature. And what we experimented with was this people you may know algorithm that I described before. So who you are suggested to become friends with, and this is a snapshot of what that looks like. These are people that you might want to friend on LinkedIn, and these are sort of shown to you as the results of this algorithm, the people you may know algorithm. And then you might choose to either make those connections or not. And the way that we designed this experiment is that some people were randomly assigned to a variant of this algorithm that suggested to them more weak ties, and some people were assigned to a variant of this algorithm that suggested to them strong ties. And since they were randomly assigned to these variants, we randomly changed the number of strong and weak ties in people's networks, 20 million people over 5 years. And this is a very large-scale global experiment. Here you see the numbers, millions of people across different variants, millions of people across the 5 different continents, the 6 different continents, I should say, and all over the world. And over 5 years. We had some experimental variation in a 2015 experiment, a 2019 experiment, and then we had jobs data all the way through to the present day. And here's what the effects of the treatment were on weak ties. So on the y-axis here, you see all of the treatment variants, A, B, C, D, E, F, and G. And you saw that some of these variants created more weak ties, as you see here for variants A and C and D and E. And some of them created more strong ties, for example, G and F. And so these were also happening across variation in the number of ties created, so we could separate having more weak ties from just having more ties. And this is important for 2 aspects of weak ties, which are things that I described earlier. The structural tie strength, the extent to which a relationship is a bridge, and interaction intensity, the extent to which a relationship is frequent or has emotional intimacy or intensity. So what did we find? The first thing we found is that here is the observational analysis or the correlation between strong and weak ties and the probability of job transmission. And what we see is almost an exact replica of Laura G. and colleagues' work, which shows that actually it's the strong ties that are most correlated with getting a job. But when we compare that to the experimental evidence, we see the exact opposite, that it in fact is the moderately weak ties that create the greatest likelihood of getting a job. And those are ones with 10 mutual friends, not more and not less. So this is really important because it confirms the strength of weak ties, and it's really important because it shows that the strength of weak ties is not linear, meaning that it's actually some sweet spot in the middle of moderately weak ties, not the weakest and definitely not the strongest, which are the best for job transmission. In terms of interaction intensity, exactly contrary to the correlational evidence, we find that the weakest ties are the best for job transmission. It's those arm's length relationships, which, as we saw from the structural variables, are the bridges between clusters that create the likelihood of employment. They're also correlated with more job applications, and the final sort of result of the paper is that this varies tremendously by industry, and you can really think about it as 2 types of industry: digital industries and analog industries. And what we find is that weak ties are most important for the most digital industries. So here we see variation across, for example, industries that are high in IT intensity or low in IT intensity, industries that are high in software use or low in software use, or high in suitability for machine learning or low in suitability for machine learning, high in suitability for AI or low, high in roboticization or low. And across the board, what we find is that industries that are more digital, that are more IT intensive, more software use, more suitable for machine learning and AI, those are the industries in which job seekers benefit from weak ties. In the more analog industries, people benefit more from strong ties. So there's a number of things stepping back from this study that we can learn, but I think the broad sort of takeaway from this is very clear in my mind. We know that networks drive employment and social mobility. The way that the human social network is structured and who you are connected to is what provides economic opportunities and employment opportunities. We also know now that algorithms shape social networks, and that these changes in social networks that are created by algorithms in turn shape economic outcomes of the individuals in these networks. So if algorithms are informed by science, then we can drive employment and we can ameliorate inequality by designing the algorithms in a way that is scientifically proven to maximize welfare for everyone in the economy. And as a concluding thought, if you sort of step away from the specifics of this study or the application area of this study, I think it's really important for us to think about, well, if we can do this, then what else could we dream of doing by really scientifically understanding how algorithms are driving economic opportunity, inequality, accessibility of resources, and if the algorithmic economy is really that important in shaping outcomes, then what is our role as scientists, as designers of algorithms and platforms, as policymakers in shaping a brighter digital future? And that's what this research really demonstrates. So thank you very much. And I really had an amazing day listening to these great ideas, and I hope you did too, and I'm looking forward to a nice conclusion as well. Thank you.